Hey, Mr. Toolbox here with the first of what I expect will be a long list of videos about Amazon's Lumberyard editor. If you're anything like me into games development, you likely noticed that Amazon released their own engine earlier this year. You may have taken a look at the documentation, gone through the Getting Started guide, and quickly noped out. It was pretty rough getting going back with the initial releases. I'm on 1.4 right now. I will tag each of these episodes with the version I'm on. If I do upgrade, I'll try to go back and make edits where appropriate. But things are getting better. The documentation is still fairly terse, and my hope here with these videos is to move beyond what's in the documentation, especially in the Getting Started guide, and really take a look at these tools, see how we put them to use to create new content. We won't just be dragging things in that Amazon have already provided for us, but how do we create new things with the tooling in place? That said, before we get down that rabbit hole, we'll go ahead and familiarize ourselves with the content of the engine and use some of the prefabs just to get familiar with navigating the viewport, finding these different view panes, things like that. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and click New Level. I've got the editor open here. We'll name this My First Level. We'll leave the folder and the terrain stuff at default. Click OK. It'll start generating that level. It'll ask me one more question about texture. I'm going to go ahead and leave these as default as well. I get an error message, and I'll disregard it for now. Here we have it. Viewport. It's the view of what's going on in our level. It's blank for now, as you'd expect. We've got an empty terrain. Moving around this perspective viewport, you have the standard controls you'd be used to, first-person shooter type controls, where W moves you forward, S moves you backwards, A strafes to the left, and D strafes to the right. If we hold down our secondary mouse button, our right mouse, and then move the mouse around, it will change the angle of the camera. So we can move it to the left, move it to the right, move it up, and move it down to kind of look around in the viewport. And then if we hold the middle mouse button and move the mouse forward and backwards, we'll see that that tracks the camera vertically upwards and down. So all handy ways to get around in this viewport. The one I find myself using most often is just right-clicking with the mouse so that I have control over the camera movement, and then using the W, A, S, and D keys at the same time to kind of fly around. You get the hang of it. I'm sure you've used it 1,000 times. If you haven't, it's fairly intuitive. Down in the bottom left-hand corner, we have a gizmo for orientation, so we can see right now I'm looking pretty well straight down the y-axis. If I turn over to the right, you'll see I'm now looking down the x-axis, and then Z, as you'd expect, is vertical. So if you're building a level that's kind of confusing spatially, you have that down there to help orient you in the global space. It could be handy. At the bottom of the perspective viewport, we have a small status bar with some helpful stuff in there. Notably, the X, Y, and Z coordinates of whatever's under my mouse. So let me zoom out just a bit. And as I track the mouse to the left and over to the right, you'll see those values for X and Y are changing. The Z is staying at 32. Why is that? What it's telling me is that whatever's under my mouse cursor is at a height of 32. And the thing under my mouse cursor right now is a flat terrain. The terrain is stuck at 32 from edge to edge. So regardless of where I move, what's under it now is that terrain at 32 height. As we start adding other objects to the scene, say a house for instance, if we had a house in the middle here, that Z value would change as we placed it, as we rolled over that. So we'll see that in action as we go. But it can be helpful to just kind of tell you where you are inside your level. Next to that, we have speed controls for our viewport movement. It's set to 1 by default. You have a 0.1, a 1, and a 10 button here. So if I was, say, down really close and working on a static mesh and I wanted to navigate around it and really look at it nooks and crannies, we can click the 0.1 and then my movement will be glacial and I can kind of get right where I want with the camera. By the same token, if I want to zoom from one level or one end of the level to the other, I can click 10 and fly there with the quickness. It can be super helpful if you're really trying to cover some distance. But 1 is a sensible default, and that's what we're set to. So let's say I am over here. I notice that there's something in the center of my level, or center-ish, that I want to go see. I can drive over there, I can set to 10 and get over there a little bit more quickly, or I can click Go to Position. And if I do that, I'll get a dialog box. It's going to ask me where I want to go and what I want the camera to be facing when I get there. So let's say 600 for X, let's say 600 for Y as well. We'll put the Z at, say, 60, just so I'm clear of the terrain, and we'll leave the camera angle alone. I can reorient myself when I get there. So we'll click Go To, and you can see it's moved me over to roughly the center of the viewport. I don't think I did so bad. You may be wondering why none of the text in this bar seems to fit inside the buttons it's given. That's a peculiarity on my system. I'm running on a 4K monitor, actually a pair of them, and I've got the text scaling set fairly high at about 150%. Lumberyard doesn't seem to play well with that, so most of my text overflows these buttons. It's not really a big deal. It's still fairly helpful. If you're using a 1080 monitor, that'll be a lot more legible, and feel free to use it as much as you can. Down below the viewport, we have the console window. That's going to hold stuff like our engine output, info, warning, error, debug messages, things of that nature. In an empty level, it's not terribly useful. If you want to go ahead, grab the divider, smush it down for a bit, that's fine. It'll give you some more space to work. But as we get working with FlowGraph, for instance, we'll be printing a lot out to debug just to make sure that the entities we've selected are doing what we want them to, and we'll use debug output for that. So I like keeping the console fairly large just so I can see those things as they go by. As I learn, making sure that things are doing what I want them to, like I said. Moving on from the console, up at the top of the screen, we have a pair of toolbars. I won't go through what each of these buttons do. There are tooltips on them. You can hover over and find out what each does. A couple I will call out, though, are the select, move, rotate, and scale tools. You'd be familiar with those from any other editor. You can just click these. They'll do what you expect them to. The keyboard shortcuts are slightly different here in Lumberyard than they would be in another editor. We have 1 for select, 2 for move, 3 for rotate, and 4 for scale. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. Your hand will be there just generally using the W, A, S, and D keys, so it is nice to remember those. If at any point you forget, you can come up here and click. It'll still work. It'll get you where you're going. Below that toolbar, we have arguably the more usable or useful of the toolbars, and that contains a lot of the views we'll be using as we put together scenes and levels in Lumberyard. If you take a look at the icons, a lot of them don't seem that intuitive. I have no idea what a stack of boxes is supposed to do. They do have decent tooltips, so you can just hold your mouse over and get a description of what they are. There are a couple here that we'll want to just sort of memorize off the bat. One is that weird stack of boxes, the database view. Another really important one, the time of day editor. If at any point you can't figure out what these are, you don't want to wait for the tooltips, there's another easy way to get to all of this, and that's in the view menu up top. So click view, click open view pane, and then you'll see down here we have all of those same windows here, the database view, the time of day, all of that's here as well. So if I click this, I'll get the time of day editor. I come back down here to this toolbar, I click this one, I'll get the same thing. So 2 ways to get at that stuff. Use whichever's more comfortable for you. These are handy. Once you memorize what they are, once you get used to using them, that'll likely be where you go. You may have noticed up again in view, open view pane, we also have some different views for the camera. So if I put together a complex scene and I want to see it in wireframe, I'll get those options up here on the top. So click top, and this is a top-down view in wireframe of my level. I can right-click and drag around to move around. Here you'll see my camera that is in the perspective viewport out here. And then with the mouse wheel, I can scroll in and out to get a more comprehensive view of what's going on in the level. Now you can dock those, do whatever you like. I'm just going to close it for now. And last but certainly not least, for the default view, over to the right, we have the roll-up bar. The roll-up bar is hugely important for Lumberyard. It is a combination of object placer, a terrain shaper, it's got some settings in it, it's got a layer selector. It also holds details for things that are selected in your view. So whatever we do as we get working with customizing what our view looks like, adding some different panels, adding windows, floating windows, tabbing windows, let's keep the roll-up bar fairly holy. We want that to be persistent. We want that to be on screen at all times as we get rolling. It's going to change what it displays based on what we've selected, and we don't want to miss those details as they come across. If I have, say, an entity selected here in my viewport, it's going to tell me some properties about it, and they may be things I want to change, and I won't know where to go to find those otherwise. So let's leave the roll-up bar where it is. We can resize it if you want. If you want it to be huge, you can do that. You can even smush it pretty well down. I kind of liked mine where I had it, which was here-ish, I guess. So I'm going to leave it there. It's got some tabs up at the top. We can click through those and see here's our terrain editing. Here's our modeling. We'll get into that later. That's for modeling 3D objects. Bunch of settings for what we see, what we don't see that we'll get into later. And then finally, our layers. So I'm going to leave mine back here at the Create tab. We'll get into what each of these do at a later time. But keep the roll-up bar where it is, happy and healthy. It'll help you along, and it's certainly worth having on screen. So now that we've poked around a bit in the editor, let's go ahead and customize our view. Everyone's going to be a bit different about their workflow, how they like things to be laid out. So I'm going to lay this out the way I like it. Certainly isn't set in stone, so do it the way you like it. As you get started, as you see what you use most often, go ahead and place those on screen. If you're lucky enough to have dual monitors, that'll be a big help. You can have another full window full of widgets over to your left or right, and that certainly is helpful. I've already resized a couple of these components, which is some slight customization, but now I'm going to add some new components, kind of full stop. So we'll click View, Open View Pane, and the first thing I'll grab is the Entity Inspector. As you can see over on the right-hand side, it's kind of snapped in over on this panel, which is where I want it, so that's good. It's empty for now, but then again, I've got nothing selected for it to be inspecting, so that's perfect. A lot of the time I'm not going to have anything selected, so I don't know if I want that always on my screen. Let's see if we can make some more efficient use out of that space. Back in Open View Pane, the Object Selector, let's grab that one. And you'll see it opened as a window. Most of these are going to do that by default. And that'll be great, because then as I build this scene out and I want to quickly navigate to certain objects, being able to see those in a list would be perfect. I'm going to grab the title bar of this window and just drag it around. And as you do that, it'll kind of show you a blue preview of where it wants to dock itself. You're welcome to keep it free floating and then just close it when you don't need it. But I'm going to drag it over here, and you'll see that it blues out the whole Entity Inspector, and that's exactly what I want. So I'm going to let it go, and we'll see what happens. I've now got the Object Selector in this space. The Entity Inspector is gone. But down at the bottom, we've got these tabs. We've got Object Selector selected now, and we have Entity Inspector right next to it. So if I click that, now I've got the Entity Inspector back. And that's great, because I'll never really be using both of those at the same time, but I'd like access to either one whenever I need it. So having those docked together and tabbable will be perfect. One other thing I like to use is going to be the component palette. It's going to help me build objects in the world piece by piece, and we'll get into why that's fun and interesting when the time comes, but let's get it on screen for now. Oh, okay, that's down here in this panel. That would work. I don't know if I necessarily like that. So I'm actually just going to grab the tab, click it, and just rip it off. So now it's its own window. Probably better. But if I grab this and shove it over here, see a new blue dock shows up. I think that's great because now I can grab pieces out of this, shove them into my world, and then have instant access to the entity that's created over on this side. Yeah, that'll be great. And I still have plenty of space for the viewport because my resolution is absurd. Perfect. So I think this is a pretty good layout. I'm going to roll with this. I'd suggest just dragging things around, figuring out what works best for you, at least as a starting point. None of it's set in stone, so change it at will, and find a workflow that looks good for you, and we'll get moving. If at some point you lose a panel or lose a window or just get so far out in the weeds that you don't think you can rebuild your view, do not despair. All is not lost. You can come up to View. Down in Layouts, you'll see two options. Save Layout, which is perfect if you like the layout you found, and then Restore Default Layout. If we click this, it'll actually shove us back into what we saw at the beginning of this video. And that's a nice kind of safeguard. So do not be afraid to experiment and to really go nuts with how this thing looks. There, so I spent a few more minutes just messing around with the view a bit. I ended up grabbing one more thing, the Entity Outliner. I shoved it over here with the component palette to use that screen real estate a little bit better. I'll use that every once in a while, especially when we get into slices and kind of building our own. So that's good. I can switch between those as I need to. And then another bit that I will use really often is going to be FlowGraph. One of the main headaches with the FlowGraph window is that if you're editing a FlowGraph and then you want to play test it, you kind of have to get around this window, and your natural inclination is going to be to close it and then to play your level. When you do that, if it works, great, but if it doesn't, you have to reopen FlowGraph and you'll be presented again with this blank view. And then you got to come down here and navigate to whatever entity or component you had with the FlowGraph and get back to it. So one thing as a proud dual monitor user I like to do is just grab this guy, shove it over to the left, and just leave it sort of perpetually open on my second monitor. It makes me happy. I can then see the viewport, navigate in the viewport, play test the level, and keep that FlowGraph open so that when it inevitably goes wrong, it's still there and I can make those edits a little bit more easily. If you have two monitors, it is a great solution. If you don't, you can still work around it. It's a little bit cumbersome, but you'll get there, and it's not to worry about. Before we go ahead and wrap up, at the risk of sequence breaking, I want to talk just for one more moment about the viewport here, the perspective viewport. In the top right corner, we have some debug information. Right now, I've got mine set for just the FPS, the frames per second. There are a couple of different levels of verbosity, and I just want to show you quickly how to get to those. In the top right corner, you'll see toggle display info. It's the little eye. We click that, mine's going to go away because I have it set to the lowest level of verbosity. But if we click it again after that, we'll see some good stuff. We've got camera position, we've got speed, time of day, DirectX stuff, shader counts, poly counts, a lot of cool stuff. Click it again, we'll get something even more verbose, and then one more time, just the FPS. That's kind of where I like it for everyday use, but there are different levels of verbosity there. I want you to be aware of that and to use it when necessary. One other thing about this perspective viewport that I'd like to talk about is going to require that we have something in our scene. So I'm going to go ahead, grab a quick brush, and don't worry about this too much, we'll talk about it later. Just going to browse down through Style Town, Architecture, Buildings, and we'll grab this first building. Drag it into the viewport. I'll zoom back a bit so I can see it and drop it down. So I've got a house in my level now, and say I'm way over here. That's good. The house is pretty far away, right? I don't have it selected anymore. I've kind of forgotten about it, but in a few minutes, I need to come back to that house and make a tweak to it, or just see how it looks with a new lighting element. In my object selector, I can go ahead and select it, And you'll see in the viewport it's now selected, but it's still way far away. And if this were a populated scene, I might not see it entirely. So if I press the Z key on my keyboard, it's going to frame right up on it. And that's a super helpful way of getting around and getting back to objects as you need to look at them. Again, that's just the Z key on the keyboard. It's different in some other editors, so I wanted you to be aware that that is there and to use it and use it well. I think that's going to wrap it up for this video, so we'll move on to some more interesting stuff in the next few, but I just wanted to get kind of our bearings, make sure everybody's level set on what this editor is, where things are, how we kind of arrange our windows, all that, and from now we can move on and start putting things to use. See you then.